I think our view at the ACMA has been that there are a number of aspects, fundamental aspects of the current regulatory regime that are coming under a lot of pressure, a lot of fundamental regulatory ideas even that are coming under stress. In fact, we've taken to publicly referring to those as broken concepts. Slightly provocative term, but deliberately designed to provoke. So things like, what is a television program? I'm not sure that we really any longer really understand even what a television program is, because in the past we had this view, I think, very much defining television by means of the mode in which it was delivered. But these days, if you look at a television program, it can be delivered all sorts of different ways, or at least video can be, and just what defines television and the matters that are of public interest is obviously a very open question. And similarly on the telecom side, we have this concept of a carriage service provider. So it's an idea of the person who provides means of communications by electronic means between two end users. But of course, at different layers of the stack, that same definition can apply to all sorts of people. So even at a quite basic level of what is the regulatory toolkit, we're seeing is a lot of pressures being brought to bear on the new environment. But probably at a sort of slightly higher level, we're moving to an environment where clearly there's going to be a broadband sort of underlying networked means of delivery, and most of the other services are moving into an applications sphere. Essentially, they're software determined, or they're software substitutes for everything, and that is clearly a radically different environment. And I think regulators around the world and governments around the world are clearly trying to get their heads around how to deal with that environment, how to manage the transition to that environment, particularly as a lot of the legacy services and networks and systems will still be there. Well, I think you're right. A lot of those complexities will be there and a lot of difficult issues to sort through. Look, one of the issues when we talk about convergence, we often think about the different communications industries coming together, broadcasting, telecoms, IT. That's what I call sort of small C convergence. There's also a deeper convergence happening, which is that communications is becoming deeply, deeply embedded into the wider economy, and it's becoming harder and harder to see the boundaries between the communication sectors and some of the broader economy. And that starts to raise really deep questions about, well, who should be regulating some of the matters and how. And if I can give you maybe an example of this, it's in relation to mobile devices, which are clearly moving into the territory of financial services, because you can already often use mobile phones and mobile payment systems to buy other products. And really, what is the difference between a postpaid mobile phone account, which you're using to buy a range of services, and a credit card? And if that's the case, should it be the communications regulator dealing with that, or your financial services regulator? Now, those kind of issues, and issues, for example, around privacy and so on, raise very, very big questions around, well, who is the right entity to be thinking about these issues and to regulate them? And yes, and that's all. But you're also correct to point out that while there may be general principles that apply economy-wide, there will often also be very specific manifestations that are in fact just relevant to a communications service. So I think I suspect future regulation will need to have a combination of principles and broad ways of doing things combined with ways of articulating specifics. And once again, there's a question when it gets to articulating specifics: should it be a regulator doing that, or should it be an industry self-regulatory process of some kind, and so on? Who is best placed to actually work through all of those issues? It was interesting when the Australian regime was set up in 1997. I think some of those ideas were anticipated to some extent. They made a decision, quite a controversial decision, and an unusual decision in some ways compared to many other countries in the world, to put the competition aspect of telecoms regulation in with the general competition regulator. The competition regulator manages its own specific regime. The ACCC manages their own specific regime, but nevertheless they are doing it as the economy-wide competition regulator, rather than the ACMA, which is the communications regulator. And I think one of the rationales for doing that was as the idea, I think, was telecoms hopefully would start to normalise as an industry, start to become clearly more complex, get more embedded, and it would make more sense to have your economy-wide regulator looking at these issues. But as things have played out, maybe it didn't happen quite as fast, and even to the extent that general competition principles have been applicable, there still has needed to be an articulation out within the telecoms industry, and I think that kind of tension will remain. And well, that's one of the reasons why, in fact, I made that observation. I think as those apps do become more prevalent, I think it's probably inevitable that the political system will probably need to address issues that arise in it. The question is, I think, where is the natural starting point for that? And I think, interestingly, the apps world, the natural starting point will be economy-wide regulation and regulate. That's where it's starting now. It's where the discussions pop up. When there's an issue with privacy and Facebook and some of those issues that we've just come out of a panel this morning. Clearly, the general starting point is not to come up with a communication-specific approach. It's actually your economy-wide entities that are raising these issues or seem to be primarily responsible for them. So it is interesting. I think they will need to be addressed. And then there's a question of consistency almost. If you end up by having a highly regulated approach to, for example, mobile premium services in telecoms, well, what is the difference between that and a very similar looking set of issues which may pop up in the IT world for applications? And sooner or later, people will start to raise those issues. And should we get similar issues of detail, of hardcore detail popping up in the apps world that reflect an issue like we've recently had in mobile premium services, I think there will be a lot of pressure for somebody to take responsibility for it. And then the question becomes, well, what tools have they got? So I think it is inevitable that the apps world will create new issues for regulators. Just who those regulators are, what jurisdiction do they have, will be interesting. The big difference between the apps world, I think, as opposed to some of the other more traditional services, is in fact jurisdiction, and jurisdiction domestically amongst regulators, but also, possibly more deeply, international jurisdictional issues, because the very nature of the apps world is that it's software and it can be provided geographically independently. So many services and issues of concern can be dealt with from overseas, and therefore you need to regulate them, you need local presence and so on. And the conflicts of laws can start to crop up.
Territorial front.
Well, it's a much more difficult environment, I think. I think you're going to have to look for new cooperation strategies. I mean, there are problems, but there have also been some successes, I think, in recent times, or at least partial successes. A good example of a partial success in recent times, I think, has been spam, which has been one of those quiet issues where individual countries have put in place their own anti-spam legislation and then started to have regulators cooperating in terms of how to address spam-related issues. And certainly Australia's been very active in that, fostering that kind of cooperation, and we've found it very useful in terms of our dealings with other regulators. Another really very topical and very necessary area to try to do something about is the issue of child pornography and issues relating to children. So that's another area where cooperation strategies are in fact very important, and I don't think our communities will particularly thank us if we don't at least try to tackle that issue fairly strongly. It comes to areas like consumer protection and e-security. E-security is going to be a very important issue for very obvious reasons, because we're all moving our economy essentially to a piece of infrastructure which is got some inherent deep vulnerabilities. That issue will have to be sort of tackled, and cooperation will have to occur to help deal with some of those matters. So. There will be areas, I think, where there will be engagement and cooperation, but you're right that that inevitably creates new issues, because particularly when it's complex, particularly the different value systems that can kick in. So I think there's going to be need to be an investment in pragmatism. Whether or not governments have got the ability to understand those complexities and then resource their regulators and others to engage in that way remains to be seen. Well, in Australia, I mean, we've got a particular set of circumstances, which is maybe a little different from some of the other countries within the AIC, in the sense that we've got, as you're probably aware, the government's got a strong commitment to a national broadband network, so probably during the course of this year and next year, that's still going to remain a very primary focus and driver for government attention. The government's also on the record as saying that they also want to conduct a review of convergent legislation at some stage along the way as well. So it's currently scheduled for next year, and so we'd be hoping, as the regulator, hoping that they will in fact do that and start to seriously examine some of these regulatory fundamentals I was talking about when I answered that first question. So if they start that process, that'll take some time, I imagine, but I think hopefully Australia will be starting to once again start to go back to almost first principles and start to rethink what some of the aspects of the regime are and should be going forward to help set us up for the next 10 to 15 years, because a number of issues need to be looked at. And they're across the board, from telecoms and broadcasting are probably the areas where there are the biggest questions to be asked, but even in areas like spectrum and so on, there are also some important issues to do with the regime itself.